When I was in my early 20s, I was really big into listening to Terence McKenna lectures. And I remember one such occurrence when he was mentioning a friend of his who he described as the real Terence McKenna. This friend was McKenna's greatest inspiration, who had access to literal barrels of psychedelic compounds produced by the government during MK Ultra, and he turned McKenna on to DMT for the first time. And, in a lot of ways, today's guest is sort of like the real Chris Rice. That is to say that a lot of the things that you as a listener may ascribe to me really originate with him. Chris Bennett is perhaps the world's leading researcher of cannabis history and particularly cannabis as a sacrament, and it has been his lifelong mission to spread the truth about this. He's probably most known for his theory that early Christians and Jesus himself used cannabis, which has been echoed by myself and others. He is also the founder of the Soma Institute, which is a private retreat center dedicated to humanity's relationship with the sacred plants. Please welcome Chris Bennett. All right, great. Hey, thanks for joining me.
You bet.
All right, so I already did the intro beforehand, so we can kind of just jump right into questions if you want.
Okay, sounds good.
All right. So first, tell me about the first time you ever used cannabis.
Oh man, I must have been only about 12 years old. And this was probably like 1974. And, kids at school were doing it. First, I was quite concerned that my classmates had taken up this drug. And I had an older brother and I'd been spying on him because I was worried he'd been partaking of drugs as well. And had snooped through his drawers and found some and showed it to my sister, and she convinced me it wasn't pot. But something cued my interest once the other kids did it. Took a couple of times before I got high, though. It was back in those days, everybody just smoked leaf. We called it commercial, and you buy these big bags of just leaf. We didn't even know what a bud was,
Oh, okay. Yeah, that's interesting. I've smoked leaves a couple of times. Not quite the same effect, but it's
we thought we got stoned, but nothing like the quality cannabis that we have nowadays. So it's come a long way since those days, at least for my 12-year-old self.
Right, of course. Hey, what made you dedicate your life to the study of his cannabis
religion
history
and
stuff?
Yeah.
I mean, what initially?
Around 1989, 90 in the winter there, I had this very powerful religious experience and using cannabis. And a number of things had brought that about. It wasn't just the substance. And I think that's true of a lot of entheogenic experiences. There's a combination of events and the substance, And for me, this series of events was there was a big controversy in Canada about the Catholic Church at an orphanage here on the East Coast called Mount Cashel Orphanage. Kids had grown up, and they said all these priests and brothers from the orphanage had been molesting them. And this was the first time this kind of issue had really been brought up in Canada, at least, about that I was aware of, that it was getting in the mainstream news and that sort of thing being talked about, And so I was gee, I wasn't really brought up with too much religion. My mom was more like the tea leaf reader and astrology type of person. And so I had the general idea of Christianity just because of all the cultural influences, the holidays. So I kind of accepted the myth, and I thought the Bible was something completely else. And at that time, I grew cannabis, and I was a surfer on the west coast of Vancouver. My whole life was based around surfing, and I had this job a few nights a week as a night watchman, and so I had a lot of time for reading. And I thought, I'm going to read the Bible, see what this Bible shit's all about. And I started reading it, and it was like so and so begat so and so, and yada yada. And I was like,
there's entire chapters dedicated to that. It seems.
And so I just kind of stuck it aside in this night watchman office and forgot about it. And another thing that happened was where I lived was this rainforest called the Clayoquot Sound. It was the last coastal old growth rainforest. And there's a big controversy brewing about the logging of it. And my brother, I grew up, working in sawmills. And my brother was actually the camp chairman for the loggers union in the area, right? And so all of a sudden, all these environmentalists showed up, and I hadn't even really had any awareness of environmentalism or anything at that time, and we're like showing up in our town, and there's this big conflict brewing. And then also coinciding with this, a friend of mine recorded this documentary from this television series called The 90s. And one of the first episodes they had was about hemp, and it had Jack Hare and Chris Conrad and other figures on it. And it was, I'd been smoking marijuana my whole life. The word hemp had been forgotten here in Canada. I was like, hemp, what the hell's hemp? And hemp's cannabis, blah, blah. And my friend told me about it. And I was like, no. I'd shown him how to grow pot and stuff. I knew all about it. He didn't know about it. And then he showed me this documentary, and I was like, whoa, there's something to this. And at that time in Canada, all grow books, high times, all that type of stuff was banned. So you couldn't get any sort of information on cannabis. But I went to the library and I looked up hemp in encyclopedias, and sure enough, I was like, wow, that's interesting. Maybe this logging issue, we can do something with hemp here to replace trees for paper or something, And then right around this time as well, the Gulf War started. The initial Gulf War started in Iraq when Saddam Hussein was the head of Iraq and George Sr. was president. And
I was a little baby.
So this had started, and people were comparing Saddam to Nebuchadnezzar, the last king of Babylon in the Bible, because Babylon actually sits in Iraq, with the same location. And Nebuchadnezzar overthrew the Jews, so Saddam loved being compared to him. And so one night, I'm sitting in this night watchman office, sitting in the lunchroom of this fish plant, empty in the middle of the night, right? And I'm smoking a joint, and I'm reading this newspaper. And at that time, all television stuff, like, wasn't the internet, right? So it was like reported in papers, all the television, what was going to be on TV, all that type of stuff, right? And I see this advertisement for the show. It was Pat Robertson. Revelations 18, the fall of Babylon. There's a picture of Robertson at the pulpit. Behind him, he has tanks and jets. And I'm like, whoa, these guys are tying in the invasion of Iraq with the book of Revelation. And I thought, I'm going to read the book of Revelation right now. So I went and I got this old Bible that I had sitting in there, and I began reading the book of Revelation. And John, he's given a scroll, and he puts it in his mouth, and it tastes as sweet as honey. And he swallows it, and it turns bitter in his stomach. And then he begins to prophesize. And I was like, well, what the hell did that guy just eat? And I read a little further, and they're talking about billowing clothes of sackcloth. And I'm thinking, that sounds kind of like hemp. And then we were given much incense to offer. And the incense held the prayers of the saints. And there were clouds of incense. And I'm like, whoa, this is really tripping me out. And I got to the end of the book of Revelation, Revelations 22. And it said, on either side of the river of life stood the tree of life, bearing 12 manners of fruit, yielding its fruit each month. And the leaves of the tree are for the healing of the nations. And when I read that, I had this experience where I felt like light just like beamed right into me. And that this was a reference to cannabis and all its uses, its fruits, where it's, ability to make oil or replace fossil fuels, or paper to replace trees, or paints and varnishes made out of hemp oil, and it's nutritious food and it's medicine. And I just started tripping right out. And I wasn't really into reggae or anything, but I knew who Bob Marley was. That must be what these Rastafarian guys are talking about. And I called my wife up at the time, my first wife, and she thought I was having some sort of mental breakdown, and she started bawling on the phone. And the next day I got up, and I was like, was there anything to that, or was I just tripping? And after that, I'd be smoking a joint, and my window looked over these clear-cut mountains, and I couldn't enjoy the cannabis because I was like, well, somebody's got to tell these people about hemp, that's for sure. And I don't know about this religious stuff, but if there's anything to it, then somebody somewhere else will have come across something, will know about it. And that set me on this path of collecting information whenever I came across it. So I started promoting hemp as an alternative to paper and for wood and stuff, and all the industrial applications. And at the same time, I just started, whenever I'd read anything about cannabis and religion, I'd keep a file, and I started collecting all this data. And I'm like a high school dropout. I had no writing experience or anything at this time, right? And so slowly it just started evolving and, getting more coherent and more documented, and years later, here I am 30 years later with 4 books under my belt and dozens of published articles on the subject. And it's taken quite seriously. And I feel that was a real revelation, that cannabis is the tree of life. I doubted it at the time. And that's why I began this path of collecting research. But now at the end of that path, having studied humanity's relationship with this plant, man, I'm convinced that this is the tree of life. This is a soma, the heoma, and this is a gift from the heavens being offered to humanity at their time of their need. Now, whether we take it or not, I don't know, man. That's to be seen.
Right. Yeah, no, that's it's truly fascinating. And I'd say for a long time people probably would have assumed something like this to be a fringe interpretation of the Bible or something like that. But in recent times, your work's kind of been vindicated by the discovery of, cannabis residue in archaeological sites of the ancient world. I'm thinking particularly about a recent
Yeah.
discovery in Jerusalem. So how do you
Well,
feel
I
finally
think
being like
yeah, I think
more
this
officially vindicated
discovery in
like that?
around Jerusalem is from a 2,800-year-old temple site in Jerusalem, and they found 2 altars. One was used for burning frankincense, and one was used for burning cannabis resins. This fits perfectly with the suggestions of the Polish anthropologist and etymologist Soma Bennett, who we all have to thank so much for her early research identifying the etymologically a word for cannabis in the Hebrew texts that make up the Old Testament books. And she pointed to this Hebrew term cannabosum and canna, and this appears in a number of places in the Old Testament. And when I first started researching it, I was troubled because the initial references to cannabosum are quite positive, but by the end, references, say in Jeremiah 6:20, it's taking quite a negative slant, And so, in order to understand why this was, I had to familiarize myself with the whole chronological story of these references. And I got together with a buddy of mine who had a master's degree in religious studies and could read Hebrew. And we began the work for 5 years on this book, Sex, Drugs, Violence in the Bible. And now these reference, this stuff in Israel is trying to be written off by some Jewish scholars as evidence of pagan activity in Israel. And this is pretty clear that this type of stuff was going on. You can read the book of Kings and Chronicles, and they're constantly battling against, people worshiping the goddess Asherah and other, Phoenician deities like Baal and other figures. You know what I mean? So there's definitely that type of stuff going on.
Sure.
And even in the Bible, there's only most of the time it is polytheistic. It's quite clear. It's only during the reign of 2 particular kings like Hezekiah and Josiah that this monotheism was really implicated in the biblical narrative, in the kingdom period. So this fits with these cannabosum references, even if it is pagan worship, because this is what Soma Bennett herself alluded to with the context of Jeremiah and some of the other, references, possibly Isaiah as well, could be seen like this, right? And so it fits perfectly, seamlessly with the etymological research for cannabosum, this material, right? And this is I think, it largely got overlooked in the mainstream media because, we've been in the midst of a pandemic, which has got the headlines filled, as well as Black Lives Matter protests were super intense when this happened in Israel. But it's slowly starting to sink in with people now that there's this evidence of it. And scholars in Israel that are looking at this are looking at these cannabosum references now. And I think we're going to see more of this type of material turn up because this is leading to the analysis of other archaeological sites and the residues found on altars and other things there, I'd suggest that they'll also find evidence of cannabis-infused wines in the area at some point, because this is indicated in the Bible that there were infused wines infused with the incense that they burned, right? So that seems quite likely as well. And we found this sort of thing in other sites as well. So I think it's fantastic. I think the archaeology is there for Soma as well. It's just it hasn't quite sunk in the academic quarters yet. The implications of certain archaeological finds that have turned up in the last, say, 10, 15 years.
I actually did want to talk to you a little bit more about that as well. So obviously within the psychedelic community, a lot of people interpret Soma as potentially being like Amanita muscaria. And I've talked with you a little bit about this before. You say that you don't believe that's so, and you have reason to believe that it's Soma.
Yeah.
Can
Well,
you just go over a
the
little
thing
bit of
about
that
R. Gordon
evidence?
Watson's book that put forth the idea that Soma was the Amanita muscaria. You need to understand. Okay, Soma, for those who don't know, is this Vedic drink from the Rig Veda. The ancient Vedas were the books of the people of India, say from about 500 BC to about 1500 BC. They really dominated, the view, and Hinduism grew out of this same religion, right? And in the Vedas, they describe a sacred drink, Soma, but it's also the moon, and it's also a god, right? And also a plant, and all these aspects are described in length in the texts that make up the Vedas. And the plant Soma is described particularly in the 10th mandala. Now, Wasson, for his identification of Soma as Amanita, he actually went to where they're talking about Soma as the moon. And the moon in the sky was seen as the celestial cup of Soma from which the gods drank. And as it waned, the gods were drinking, and as it's filled, it was replenished. And that's why a lot of the Soma rituals were based around the moon. And so he looked at the wrong thing, and then he discounted the 10th mandala, saying that it was one of the last things written in the Vedic period. So they had already lost the identity of Soma by then. It was lost. But then to make his case, which, part of his case for the Amanita muscaria being Soma is the drinking of urine. And because the psychoactive properties of the Amanita muscaria can be passed through the human body into urine, drank, and you can get high again off of it. And so when he went to that, he went way past the 10th mandala to texts written like 1500 years later, and a story of some guy, a story of some yogi being tricked by a god into drinking his urine, right? And you got to remember, urine has medical properties in Ayurvedic medicine, Tibetan medicine, and stuff like that, right? So just the drinking of urine doesn't necessarily mean people are trying to get high. There's they view that there's medicinal qualities of it, right? Now, if you look at the 10th mandala description of Soma, it describes it as a green and purple tree. And it describes the process of making the Soma by smashing it with rocks, and the faces of the rocks being turned green from smashing the Soma. It's a very similar way to the preparation of bang with a mortar and pestle. Bang's a drink that they still make from cannabis in India. And many Indian scholars see the two as identical. And that's another thing. The idea of the Amanita muscaria being Soma is purely a concept of Western scholars. I cite numerous indigenous Indian scholars that view Soma was likely cannabis. There's just lots of them.
Chris, I'm just being devil's advocate here for a moment. If there were bang or bong, and there were also Soma, and they have separate names.
Well, Soma's described as bong in the Vedas, so.
Perfect.
Another thing about Soma, I'm not saying that other plants weren't used. Clearly, multiple plants were used. They lost Soma for a while. There's no doubt about it. The initial use of Soma, it was imported, and a lot of there was no cannabis grown indigenous in India until much later. And they know this from soil samples and that sort of thing, right? It came with the Aryan people that brought the Vedas with them into India. And descriptions of the importation of Soma and the problems involved with it, the low quality and the taxes that were put onto it by the importers and these sort of things, all that type of stuff contributed to its decline and loss, as did the loss of trade routes through foreign problems, domestic problems, right? Now, my view is that now, also, it should be noted that Soma has a counterpart in Persia, in the Avestan religion. This is the religion that was around before the Zoroastrian religion, which grew out of it, which is still around. In the Avestan religion, in the Avestas, they have a drink called Heoma. We know that these Soma and Heoma originated from the same earlier source because of the similarity in names and also similarity in mythologies and gods' names and things like that involved with it. But they both took on their own flavor as they spread apart into their own paths, right? Now, my view is based on current archaeological and etymological evidence, is that we know, like, okay, both the Avesta and the Vedas are written in the Indo-European language. Indo-European language is the mother language for most of our Western dialects: English, French, German. They're all Indo-European language, but also the Sanskrit and the language of the Avesta as well, right? And this means that our common heritage with these people, especially language-wise, right? And we know that this is common because of similarities in words between all these different languages. In the case of cannabis, it's usually drawn upon the AN in cannabis, which is in bong and chamvra and hemp and other counterparts in various different languages, right? And this word, root word for cannabis in the Indo-European language is kana. And it's even older than Indo-European languages. So before all these other languages split off, there's Proto-Indo-European language, the language that Indo-European languages grew out of. And that's where the name Kana is. So that's how old it is in Indo-European culture, right? You know what I mean? It goes way back. It's like one of the oldest forms of root words there is, right? Now, these Indo-European people, they spread all over into India, into the Mideast, into Europe, and all these different places, right? One of the places they went was central China. And we now have archaeological evidence of the Gushi culture, which was an Indo-European culture, basically Caucasian, that lived in central China from 2000 BC up until about 400 BC, when the indigenous Han Chinese chased them out of the region. And we know that these people were using cannabis and ephedra because both of these plants were found in tombs, numbers of tombs of these Gushi people. And we found it in forms of female flower cannabis prepared in a basket, female flower cannabis on its stalk laid over a body, sensors that were used for burning cannabis over on hot rocks and other ways, right? And these Gushi were in contact with the Chinese, and we see around 500-600 BC the rise of the use of cannabis amongst the Taoist Chinese, who referred to cannabis as a plant of immortality. Now, the Taoists and other Chinese people, they refer to cannabis as huma, and this has been interpreted as both fire cannabis or Scythian cannabis. And that's interesting because, like these Gushi people, the Scythian people, they burn cannabis in funerary rituals in similar braziers, inhaling the fumes. It's the same way. So it's obviously part of the same cultural complex. Now, we also, like the discovery of these Indo-Europeans in China has totally altered our concept of trade in the ancient world. Before the discovery of these people, it was thought that the Silk Road originated sometime around 100 BC, say. Now, with the discovery of the Gushi culture, this has been put back more than 1,000 years prior to that. And we know that these Gushi people were in trade with other people because we have examples of cowrie shells from India in there. They've done DNA study on the mummies, and they have Eastern European DNA and DNA from India, all mixed people for sure, right? And one of the places that we know that they were in contact with because of archaeological finds of artifacts that were from both places exchanged, right? Was this region known as the Bactria Margiana Archaeological Complex. And in this site, a Russian archaeologist, Victor Sarianati, claims that he found 3 temples that were dedicated to making the Soma Heoma beverages by the Mazdians, the religion that preceded Zoroaster, right? And he says what he found there was cannabis, ephedra, and in some cases opium. And as I mentioned, ephedra was up in these Chinese tombs. Cannabis and ephedra in China have an interesting relationship. Their names are reversed. One's Huma and one's Mahua. And they kind of have a yin-yang relationship in effects as well. So it's interesting that their names are kind of reversals of each other. And my view is, and then in between, so how did the stuff from China get over to this region in Afghanistan known as the Bactria Margiana Archaeological Complex? Well, it was thought to have been brought over by Scythian traders. And as mentioned, the Scythians used cannabis in the same way as the Gushis, burning it. But they also drank cannabis. And we know this from the finds of golden goblets, which showed residues of both cannabis and poppy that were found at Scythian sites, as well as other cups that show evidence of a cannabis drink, and a wine skin as well that had evidence of cannabis in it. And one of the names, the Scythians are known by many different names. One of the names that the Scythians were known as was the Heoma Varga, the Heoma gatherers. And Sarianati makes it quite clear it was Scythians bringing this stuff into this region. So now we have the archaeological, and so my view is that the Chinese name for cannabis, right, traveled out of China with the product, the really good quality product that they were preparing there, into the Bactria Margiana Archaeological Complex with its Chinese name. And this is a view of other etymologists and linguists. Huma became Heoma, and then through further linguistic changes, Heoma becomes Soma as it goes into India, right? So I think the archaeological evidence is there to make that case. It's just a matter of people, understanding. A lot of these people, that have accepted Wasson's interpretation of Soma, that's all they've ever read is Wasson's book, and it's gone without question. And I think I rip Wasson's theory apart in my own book. I do a big in-depth analysis and go over my own criticisms of it, but as well, I scoured, books and things like that, looking for what other people had to say about it, other Vedic scholars and things like that. And even Wendy Doniger, who did Wasson's translations for him, didn't ever accept Amanita muscaria as Soma, So it's kind of weak. And then you have the situation where other people just take it as a given, and then they build their own theories on it. Say like Mike Crowley's spurious book, Secret Drugs of Buddhism. And so it's a real problem overcoming this bad idea, but we shall overcome, and I'm sure more archaeological data will show up to back up the case for Soma, as it's doing in other areas, and more and more scholars as well, once they become familiar with the data involved with identifying cannabis as Soma, the original Soma, right? As I say, many plants came to be Soma. Even in these accounts here, it's more than one plant. A lot of it was the ritual blessing of it that turned bang into Soma, right? And that's how other plants came into use. But I don't see, I don't deny that many different plants were used. It's written about in the ancient text. But as far as mushrooms, I don't know. I've never seen anything convincing myself in regards to mushrooms for Soma, and that includes McKenna's idea that psilocybin mushrooms could have played a role as well. I don't think so. I don't see the evidence for it. And it's nothing against mushrooms. I've had very powerful experiences on mushrooms, and they have their own great spiritual history, particularly here in North and South America. So it's not any sort of rejection of mushrooms as a spiritual tool that I'm basing it on. It's just that when I do historical research, I base it on actual historical material, not my personal preferences for entheogens.
Certainly, yeah. I mean, the one thing that I think McKenna has going for him with his theory is the reverence for the cow
But there's
in
no
Hinduism
indications
and
anywhere in
its
the Vedas of
association.
anybody eating mushrooms from cow poop. You know what I mean? And there's clear descriptions if you read the 10th Mandala. There's very clear descriptions of a plant. You know, it's green and purple and all these colors are used. And these are translations that are not done by anybody trying to champion any sort of entheogenic candidate, just straight translations of the Vedas and stuff, right? And I think that's something we all have to be careful of. You know, if somebody's using their own translation, it's like you want to take a look at some unbiased translations as well.
Kind of like John Marco Allegro with
he was a great scholar, but
Mushroom.
Sacred Mushroom is just the worst crap ever, in my opinion. And his other books were pretty good. He was an actual Dead Sea scholar. You know, that book kind of ruined his career because it was so poorly put together.
Chris, before we move on from Soma, do you want to just plug your book for anybody who might be lineing who wants to look
you can check out my book on Soma. It's called Cannabis and the Soma Solution. You can find that on Amazon. And then my newer book, I imagine we'll discuss a bit of that, Liber 420, Cannabis, Magical, and Other Magical Herbs in the Occult. It is my most recent one, and that deals with say the time period after the Islamic period and into European alchemy and magic and that kind of stuff, which I think is really, in many ways, kind of a continuation of these earlier traditions we were just talking about.
Well, that's a great segue. I actually did want to talk to you specifically about that. Cannabis in the Middle Ages, particularly in terms of magic and in witchcraft.
Sure. Yeah. I would say that, the Western magical tradition begins with a magical grimoire that has cannabis and opium and mandrake and other drugs quite prevalently throughout it. And this is the 10th century text known as the Picatrix. It was translated in the 12th century from the 10th century Gayat al-Hakim, which was an Arabic grimoire. And in the 12th century, King Alfonso of Spain had this translated into Latin. And it's kind of the original premier magical document. Agrippa and other early sources were all quite familiar with it. So there's drugs right in it. And in the Picatrix, cannabis resin, a pound of cannabis resin mixed with stag blood and other things, is used for a fumigation ritual in which the spirit of the moon, and here's this connection back to the Soma stuff again, is visualized in the pillar of smoke that arises from the burning of all this cannabis resin, right? So, and this is interesting too, in the context of what was happening in the evidence out of Arad, Jerusalem, right? Because in the Picatrix, and this is a very common way of using cannabis in magic, the cannabis is burned, and you not only get an effect from the cannabis, but the vision is actually witnessed in the pillar of smoke rising out of the burning of the things, and this is the eye is often trying to perceive patterns out of chaos. If you stare at a fuzzy TV screen for an hour, you'll start to see pictures in the fuzz because your mind struggles to make sense of chaos, right? And this is why,
even with your own closed eyes, you'll see hypnogogia. I mean, especially
but
if you're in a tank
your
or
mind
something
will
like
often
that.
try to identify things, and so you'll see something. Well, is that like a dog in the smoke? I think I see it, something like that, right? And so in the case of of the first of these cannabism references from Exodus 30:23. God who appears in flames of fire from within a burning bush commands Moses to make this holy anointing oil, and he burns it on the altar of incense. And then he speaks to the Lord in the pillar of smoke over the altar of incense. It says the angel of the Lord appears in the pillar of smoke. It's referred to as the Shekinah, and refers to the physical presence of God in the temple, in the smoke pillar. Similar thing with the Picatrix, right? And it was also an anointing oil, and in other grimoires, such as Sefer Raziel Liber Salamanas, which is a grimoire of Jewish magic, there's an anointing oil in that as well that contains cannabis mixed with devil's trumpet, I believe it was, and I'm not sure what plant it was, probably some nightshade. And this was used for seeing visions in a magic mirror. This is one of the more common ways that cannabis and other drugs were used in the magic terms, was with magic mirrors. And that you would take the drug and you would stare at this black opaque mirror until you started to see visions, and then you'd start to record the visions, right? And so here we see an anointing oil used for the same purpose in a Jewish text, that's from the 16th century. So, we're probably talking about, 2,500, 2,800 years after that other stuff was written about, right? You know what I mean? The continuing practice of it for oracular purposes in the same way. Alchemy wise, it was often used in alchemical preparations known as quintessences. And quintessences, or arcanums also is another name for it, were alcoholic tinctures, basically just herbal tinctures of various substances. And they thought they could increase the potency of any given herb up to 20 times by preparing them in these tinctures. And, we have recipes with cannabis in them coming from such well-known alchemists as Paracelsus. In the 16th century, Zosimo's, one of the four figures of alchemy from the 4th century, writes about the use of cannabis and other drugs in beers and wines for magical purposes in the 4th century, and of course in the alchemical and Jewish alchemical texts. We also find references to these cannabis-infused tinctures, other herbs as well. There's various quintessences, various arcanums. Each plant would make its own quintessence or arcanum, right? Once infused into one of these alcoholic preparations. So there's actual references to this. It's interesting because people had said, no, there's no references to cannabis to me for years in alchemy. And we live in this incredible time period where books from every library are getting scanned into the internet, into Google Books. And this includes 15th, 16th, 17th century books. And luckily, a lot of these are written in Latin, and cannabis is spelt often the same way in Latin or slight variations. And so you're able to look through all these Latin books in a single scan, just looking at 16th century books. And then you can scan, who mentioned cannabis. You find all these books, a lot of it's agricultural advice and things like that. But once in a while, you find some alchemical text, and then you can get that reference translated into English. And it's material nobody's seen for centuries, you know what I mean? And so there were alchemical recipes that I found from figures that were well-known figures in alchemy, like the Lullian Corpus and Cardano and Paracelsus, as I mentioned, where there's, indisputable direct references to these cannabis recipes. And so it's really fascinating that, how important a role, and this is like the predecessor to medicine, modern medicine, even at the halls of the Royal Academy, the very original scientific headquarters. We have the founders of the Royal Academy, Robert Boyle and Robert Hooke, all mentioning, cannabis and even mushrooms and things, right? Right in their thing. So this, they were trying to understand how these things were used by the alchemists. This is where alchemy divides from magic and becomes science. You know what I mean? And the role of cannabis medicine even then was pivotal, just as it is today with the discovery of the endocannabinoid system, which has revolutionized modern medicine. Just as relevant with the foundation of medicine as well was the study of cannabis and other plants and their extraction methods.
So while we're talking about, a moment ago we were talking about like
Yep.
divination rituals to some degree, and obviously magic. I wanted to get your thoughts on the Eleusinian mysteries, and kind of more specifically the assertions made by the book, The
Yeah, yeah.
Immortality Key.
You
I
know,
think we had discussed this a little
I can't
previously.
say that I'm much of an expert on Eleusis. I just had for years taken it for granted that Ruck and Watson and these guys were likely right about the ergot and stuff like that. Although I've read Tom Hatzis's work, and he disputes that and suggests there's better evidence for opium and other things. And I think that he puts forth a pretty good argument, right? What I do know though is he also, ties in the Immortality Key the whole Dionysian mysteries, and the Eleusinian mysteries and the Dionysian mysteries both kind of sprung from the same sort of Orphic lineage, right? And in that Orphic and Dionysius lineages, there is a lot of evidence for cannabis in regards to the suggestion of the use of cannabis by the cult of Dionysius. We have such people as the noted professor of religious studies, probably one of the foremost figure in the history of religious studies, Mircea Eliade, suggested that the Thracian cult of Dionysius was likely burning cannabis through the identification of the Kapnobate, the smoke walkers, the shaman smoke walkers of the Thracians, and the connection with the Thracians with the Scythians, right? And also Erwin Rhodes, who's one of the great German classical scholars, he as well suggested the use of cannabis by the Thracian cult of Dionysius. Now, Dionysius is a very, very, very old god, worshipped, he's around even before the Greeks had started worshiping. And when Alexander the Great went into India, he went into this region of India where Shiva was worshipped, and they were preparing wine, which is like Dionysius's drug. You know what I mean? Was not something that was commonly seen, the pressing of the grape. And the worshippers of Dionysius and Shiva embraced each other as brothers. And there's like loads of ancient material written by people, 2,500 years ago, talking about the connections between Shiva and Dionysius and how they're the same identical god. And when Alexander arrived in this area, he thought he had found the ancient childhood home of Dionysius, and it was the same god, right? And we know Shiva's relationship with cannabis as well, right? And so even Murescu, who wrote the Immortality Key, his mentor, Professor Carl Ruck, he has suggested that cannabis wine may have been drunk by the cult of Dionysius based on this association and connection with Shiva, as well as these Thracian references that I've discussed, right? So that's pretty powerful stuff. And then we found evidence of cannabis-infused wines in regions where Dionysius worship was taking place. Murescu, he does mention a find in Pompeii, where large amounts of cannabis, a whole vat of cannabis particularly, along with poppies and other drugs and even some animal parts and lizard parts and things like that, were being mixed with wine, and this may, one archaeological paper on this suggested that this was a site for making medicines known as, I'm just trying to think of the name of them now. It's an old theriac. Theriac was the name of it. And I talk about theriacs in Liber 420 because these were alchemical references. And there's cannabis used in theriacs for sure, as well as the other drugs. So there is a lot of evidence that theriac was being prepared there. But one of the archaeologists that worked directly on the sites feels that this was a factory for preparing drugs. And Dionysius was worshipped in Pompeii. And then in another region of France, going back about 2,200 years, I think it is, they have as well found evidence of a cannabis-infused wine. And we know that Dionysius worship was also taking place in France as well, right? So these infusions may have traveled with that cult, right? And Murescu believes that this influence filtered into early Christianity through all the use of like the wine as the Eucharist and descriptions in the Last Supper, and Jesus changing water into wine, which he says is a miracle of Dionysius. Some dispute that, and that this is how, right? Now, interestingly, the Hebrews have their own tradition of infused wines, right? In the book of Amos, it talks about how they are drinking the wine of the condemned in the house of their God. And the wine of the condemned was this wine where they would put incense into it for those who were going to be executed to ease their pain. You know, we know that the Jews were now burning cannabis incense, right? You know what I mean? And cannabis put into a wine would certainly ease the pain. And the condemnation was that the prophets were drinking this infused wine in the house of the gods, right? And biblical scholars in the 19th century, and this is even in the Encyclopedia Britannica, they wrote about these infusions, and they went further to suggest that Jesus himself received such a preparation on the cross, right? And this is something I've written about in a number of books, you know, because
Wait a second. So that's in the
yeah, like in the
Encyclopedia
1850s,
Britannica from that time
1860s, you
period?
know, old ones, not in modern,
Wow, yeah.
Encyclopedia Britannica. I don't know when they dropped it, but it was in there for
Yeah, of
more
course.
than a few editions, that's for sure. And I've got a big
Wow.
article. If anybody wants to find out more about this, it's the cannabis infused wine of Dionysius, and I hypertext to all the source material like the Encyclopedia Britannica, which I just mentioned. Right now, this is really interesting to me because I've always been taken with the ideas of Professor Hugh Schoenfield, who in his book written in the 60s, The Passover Plot, suggested that Jesus was given an infusion on the cross that made him go into a death-like coma. So they only thought he was dead. And this is interesting because in the 19th century, a Dr. James Braid of Edinburgh, he wrote a booklet called Trance and Human Hibernation. And he pointed to fakirs and yogis in India who would mesmerize Western researchers by having themselves buried for a week and then dug up and being in perfect, coming to and being in perfectly fine shape. And he was suggesting that this was procured through yogic techniques combined with the consumption of very potent cannabis extracts. And in fact, the first anesthesia ever recorded in text took place out of China. It was a cannabis-infused wine, and a doctor there was using it for performing complicated operations. And in the same time that Braid was writing his text, William O'Shaughnessy was experimenting with cannabis in India and throwing people into full-on cataleptic states. Cataleptic states is where your body goes stiff like a state of rigor mortis. It freezes, and your breath drops down to the very shallow breathing. Your heartbeat, you have to really listen for it to hear it. It just drops to a few beats, and can actually mimic death. So now this brings up this whole idea. We have this idea. Marescu's talking about the use of these infused wines in death and rebirth rituals, right? That's what they were used for, death and rebirth rituals. And so we have this situation where this type of thing can actually, and we know from Zoroastrian accounts where they're drinking, and these are actual Zoroastrian texts, where they are drinking cannabis-infused wines. People are knocked out into this death-like state. No one is starved, appear dead to the people looking at them. And then when they return, they come back with their colorful visions, right? And so here's the same situation where there's, indicated access to these substances and a possible way that it could have been used, suggested by Hugh Schoenfield and numbers of scholars in the 19th century saying that Jesus himself, in fact, did take such an infusion of cannabis when being crucified on the cross. Sounds preposterous, but the alternatives are that a man actually rose from the dead after being dead for 3 days.
Right, right. Hey, so on that note, I mean, as probably, you know, the world's leading researcher on cannabis history and stuff like that, have you tried like cannabis infused wines? Have you tried, you know, imbibing it
Um,
in that
well,
way and in those variety of
I
ways that you
have
find
tried a little bit,
in the ancient world?
I've made cannabis in anointing oil, but you need so much of it, right? And it's not very effective. And you got to remember,
Yeah, the ratio
yeah,
is very
uh,
very
um,
high.
and you got to remember that these people were not like regular imbibers of cannabis. This was not an everyday thing for them. You know what I mean? It was a rare commodity used for specific special purposes. The Zoroastrians did not drink cannabis wine on a regular basis. The cannabis wine was used for a specific person at a specific time to seek sacred information. It wasn't
Right, so they might
yeah,
not necessarily have the
yeah,
colors
right.
that you or I could have.
Or the experience with the state of consciousness that it produces, right? You know what I mean? And more
Most
so,
certainly. Yeah,
also,
yeah.
no concept of chemicals affecting the brain or anything like that. Any of this type of thing back in these days was interpreted as some sort of possession or some sort of magic or something, right? Um, and so, you got to take all that into context. Now, I've made cannabis wine, and you get a nice heady buzz from it, no doubt about it. Good way to make that is if you have a vaporizer, just save all the stuff that you've been vaporizing, and then throw a good handful of that into a bottle of wine, shake it every few days, and after a few days, you can drink it, right? Or you could do that with hard alcohol as well, and make a tincture, right? Um, and you get a nice buzz and stuff like that. I don't drink alcohol, so it's not something I've been too drawn to it, right? um so I have tried some, but I haven't made soma like with the sort of preparation that Serianati's been talking about, with ephedra combined in it. But I've made bong numbers of times, and I've made very, very powerful infusions of it where I've had like psychedelic like experiences under it, where it was way too much. You know what I mean? I've dreamed out. Yeah,
Oh
yeah.
yeah,
So I
I've
know
been
that
there.
people can have powerful
Yeah.
experiences with it, a lot different when you do that in a religious context with no experience with cannabis. And so the
Oh,
potential
I'm
is
sure, yeah.
there, um, for all that. But, more importantly, it's like in cases like the Zoroastrian references, it's not a matter of interpretation. They use the terms banga, or in Pahlavi, banga's Manakart mang, which are references to cannabis. You know what I mean? And so it's the actual word cannabis is right in the description of what they're talking about. And so it's not a matter of interpretation. That's just the way it is. And we see this later in the Persian region with the hashashin. It's like it's just a cultural difference between the Zoroastrians and the Islamic people. And we know that Zoroastrian, just as it influenced biblical concept, influenced Islamic concepts even more. And the whole account of the hashashin, they take the hashish drink, and then they wake up in a beautiful garden filled by houris, which is the afterlife experience of the Islamic world. The 140 virgins for the
Mhm.
martyrs, or whatever it is. And it's the exact same experience. The only difference is the cultural and religious interpretation of that experience. But they are knocked out, they wake up, they go back to sleep, and they wake up again, and they're back home. And it's just the continuation of that same sort of thing. And it's interesting because in that account, they're described as going into a death-like coma as well. And in the first three European accounts of cannabis in the medieval Renaissance period, which appear in the Decameron, Marco Polo's Adventures, and I'm trying to think of what the third one is. I can't recall it right now. But they're all describe the use of cannabis, and then the people, like in the Decameron, the guy's giving cannabis, and people think he's dead, and he gets put into into like a tomb, you know, and just kind of like the same
Yeah,
sort of thing.
yeah.
And then it was all a trick performed on him by some priest, right? And so the guy thinks he's died, and then he sees the evil of his ways and kind of repents out of it a bit, right? Once he comes back. And so they all have this same sort of death coma in them, the first accounts of it. So there was an association even then that cannabis could knock you out and you'd appear like you were dead and you could wake up from it.
Sure. So, taking it into the 21st century a little bit, I wanted to see your opinions on the trend toward legalization and commercialization of cannabis. And also, I know you're Canadian, but I was wondering what you think a Biden administration may mean for cannabis legalization here in the
Well, I
United
think,
States.
it's like always a choice of lesser evils in politics, unfortunately, but I think that Biden and Harris were certainly the lesser evil between Trump and Pence, and they certainly have a better outlook on cannabis. A lot of people point to Harris's work while she was in Justice, and she was seeing a lot of blacks arrested for cannabis offenses and things, and saying, oh, she's not on our side. Fair enough, but she's progressed on the issue. She's speaking quite clearly about federal decriminalization, and I don't think those words are necessarily cheap. I think that there's more of a chance, even though both of Harris and Biden haven't been good on the cannabis. A lot has happened with cannabis and state legalization and science and all that type of stuff. And I think there's more will in the Democratic caucus and stuff to see that change than there is in the Republican caucus, Now here in Canada, where we're a couple of years
Yeah,
into
couldn't agree more.
legalization, a lot of people have been pissed because there was definitely, there was already, cannabis was legalized. There was already an existing infrastructure of head shops and dispensaries and that type of thing that were working under illegal. They were operating illegally, right? But they were already there. They were in everybody's towns, and there was a lot of cities had made it okay for them to do it, or provinces and that sort of thing, right? So on the municipal level, they were accepted,
sure.
right? Now, when the federal government came in, they just wanted to take over the whole goddamn industry. And so what we witnessed here were the very cops and politicians that we've been battling against. And I'm talking about individuals we know we're battling against the legalization of cannabis, cops and politicians, for decades. And we know these people because we were dealing with them. And then all of a sudden they're being appointed the heads of these various corporations or figures, high-ranking figures in these various corporations that were taking over the industry. And they made it so laden with paperwork and costs that was only big corporations that could really afford to get into the industry. But what has happened is the grassroots illegal industry continued alongside of this. And so we've seen a situation here, I paid probably like $100 for an ounce of good quality cannabis here, right? That's from the black market. And it's easy enough to find, you know what I mean? In the 2 years it's been legal, I think I bought 2 joints just to check it out from a store. That's it. And the cannabis is all radiated. And so that does something to the cannabis, in my opinion. Take something out of it. I don't want radiated cannabis, sterilized, there's a sterilization process, and that takes all life right out of it. Whatever life's in there is gone now, right? So you get much better cannabis illegally for less than half the price of the legal cannabis. And so the government's trying to get its head around this because they want to get their tax dollars. And the corporations that thought that they were going to make billions off of legal cannabis are going tits up and out of business. And this is happening all over, right? And so what they're looking at now is widening the definition of legal and opening it up more and more to grassroots, craft level cannabis, you know what I mean? And making room for type of small time beer brewery type of level cannabis growing. And that's really, really expanding. And it's due to people holding out on the legal cannabis and not buying into this corporate model. So, although people were like, oh, we should never have legalized it, some people, you know what I mean, the vocal critics, there's a certain Smurf element out there in the cannabis world that will only settle for, being able to grow cannabis out of your backyard and sell it out of your front yard with no regulation. And sorry, folks, that's maybe we can get there one day, but that's not how things work in legislative politics. legislative politics happens in steps. And step one was getting the stuff legalized, and we continue from there. And, we've had legal alcohol here in Canada for over 100 years, and we're still messing with alcohol regulations, right? And we're going to be messing with these cannabis regulations and fine tuning these for decades. Get used to it, but it's still better. People aren't going to jail for possession. And if you really want to get into the cannabis industry, you will find your way into it. We take a look at what's happening in the various states in the US. Some states do it shitty, like Washington. Some states do it a little better, like Oregon. There's variations of these things, and you got to kind of look at what's going on. And even if maybe it's not perfect in your state when they're trying to bring something in, consider that it's got your foot in the door, and there's going to be time to change things further as time goes on.
Yeah, I mean, here in Massachusetts, we're in actually a pretty similar boat, I think, to what you said you're experiencing in Canada, where the black market is still thriving. It's less than half the price. So, I do see them moving towards, craft cannabis industry, allowing cooperative growing and things along those lines. I do fear, though, like you were talking about earlier, kind of the commercialization and almost like the gentrification of not only the cannabis industry, but also, obviously people are pushing towards legalizing other entheogenic plants, mushrooms and stuff like that. And it does seem like the trend is going to be towards
that's the problem here in Canada.
these
I helped to get like in Canada, there's a petition process for approaching the government, and if you can get over I think it's 500 signatures on your petition, they'll talk about whatever the issue is in the House of Parliament with all the politicians. And we could see that happening here, the corporate kind of takeover. And it's a real gatekeeper model. Same with the religious model. You know what I mean? Like, I'm a spiritual user, but I think the right to cannabis and other psychoactive plants is a natural human right. It goes beyond religious freedom. It's life on earth and indigenous relationships between plants and people. It goes back thousands, tens of thousands of years. And so it's like a natural right, like our right to air and clean water, right? And what the problem with the corporate model is creates a situation of gatekeepers where you have to be with therapists, or a religious model creates a model of religious hierarchies that control the sacraments. So we said that this was a natural human right, and we put forth this petition arguing that. And that's gone. We got like 15,000 signatures, so well over the 500 required, and that's going to bring up the topic into the House of Parliament here when they rejoin after the recess. And we'll kind of at least bring the topic up into the mainstream news and stuff as it's getting in there more and more. So my feeling is that, the corporate model, the pharmaceutical model, the religious model, they're all fine if they're working from a model where everybody has a natural right to these things. And with this right comes responsibility. Because you're responsible for what you take and what you use, and you're responsible to know about it. You know what I mean? And so it's a big step for people. There's a lot of irresponsible people out there. But there's also a situation where people are blindly putting their faith in with therapists. Here we had a big MDMA study, a legal study in Canada, first study of its kind, with MDMA. And one of the therapists got a romantic relationship with the first patient, which is classic example of what not to do. But you're doing a sensual drug like MDMA is, that type of stuff can rise up, and that's the dangers. And same with the religious models. You know what I mean? People, what if the only if you're in a church like, say, the Santa Daime, you get caught into this whole Catholic like cosmology. Is that the only place you can take your medicine, is with this Catholic cosmology? Maybe that's not your cup of tea. I want to have my sacrament without the cosmology. I've got nothing against shamanism and rituals, but when it comes to psychedelics, man, I'm more of the Aldous Huxley school of shamanism, where it's about my mind and the experience in my mind, less about the rituals and beliefs of the people administering it to me.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. While we're on that note, I did want to talk to you a little bit about the Soma Institute. Obviously your focus is on the protection of humanity's relationship to these sacred plants, and I just wanted
Sure,
to see if
yeah,
you wanted to talk about
like
that at all.
initially, we had got this property and we wanted to create a retreat space for people that were holding ceremonies and that sort of thing, right? You know what I mean? And then they could rent it off us, and it's a few acres with cabins and a big 25-foot teepee and a wood-fired hot tub, wood-fired sauna, and using it solely as that. Once COVID hit, we've moved out here now and are living here ourselves. As well, we've got greenhouses on the properties, and we've been planning on filling, we've been building a lot of stuff. So a lot of the last couple of years is just kind of getting the foundation ready. But, in this next year or so, we're hoping to see a variety of entheogens growing in the greenhouses as a nursery and acting as a place of preservation for botanical examples of these various substances, as well as like having a library on the property dealing with the culture and history and science about these substances. We also have Colorado river toads on here in a big tank, and we're hoping to breed them. And dedicating, when I use the name Soma Institute, I use the name Soma as kind of a generic term like entheogen for all the plant sacraments.
Sure,
and so
sure.
this property is dedicated to preserving and celebrating humanity's relationships with these messengers of Gaia, these messengers of Mother Earth that are here right now in our time of need. And I really think that's the big thing right now. You know what I mean? You take some mushrooms and you go for a walk in the forest, and that forest isn't a commodity to you, man. It's a living entity that's breathing and existing, and you become one with nature. You know what I mean? And that's the real potential of these substances, to take us back into the Garden of Eden, and make us celebrate that in a time where the world's fallen apart around us, and that's what I think is one of the really beautiful things about cannabis activism, man. It's one thing you can do that affects so many of these different areas. And we could take a look at the earth, man, and the deforestation taking place on earth, and talk about how 1 acre of hemp can produce as much paper as 4 acres of trees over the same 20-year period. Or we could talk about how it could replace fossil fuels for energizing our cars, or replace soil depleting cotton for clothing us, or how it could produce enough seed, because when you grow cannabis for its seed, half the weight of the plant is seed, enough seed, and the most digestible source of protein is in that seed to feed the world, man. And we could talk about how it affects us medically. And we see parents today curing their children of deadly epilepsy. And it's important to remember that this same epilepsy was considered demonic possession at the time of Jesus. And we know that cannabis was used for epilepsy from references in Assyria before Jesus, and from Paracelsus's recipe for cannabis, which was for epilepsy, right? You know what I mean? And glaucoma and cancer and all these different ailments that cannabis, even COVID, the science is, showing up on cannabis for COVID from a number of different angles. So this incredible medicine that's revolutionized our modern medicine with the discovery of the endocannabinoid system. And then we could talk about it as a world sacrament, and we could talk about how it has played a role in the oldest existing world religions, man. It was back there in Taoism in ancient China, used as the plant of immortality. It was there in Hinduism with Shiva, who's been worshipped since the Stone Age. His favorite plant's cannabis. It was there in the Vedas and the Avestas, Soma and Heoma. It was there with Buddha under the Bodhi tree when he subsisted on 1 hemp seed a day before announcing his divine revelations. It was in the temples with the prophets, man. They're inhaling that smoke and talking to their God, man. And it was in the healing oil of Jesus Christ, Christ is the Greek translation of Messiah and makes direct reference to this messianic oil, means the anointed one. And Jesus baptized no one, but he did send out the 12 apostles with oil to heal the sick and cast out demons, which means curing them of epilepsy. And here it is in this time when, we've seen the world's religions ridiculed by the likes of Trump and other people, and humanity has never been more separated by their beliefs and divisions. As the world goes down this tree of life, this Soma and Heoma is here right now, offering us a paradigm shift. And we could take two pathways. We could take that petroleum oil-filled pathway of Koch and Trump and the likes of those people, or we can go back to the greening of the earth and return this place back to the Eden it was meant to be. That's what I think, man. That's what the future holds. Decision is yours, man.
Oh, man. Yeah, Chris, this has been great. I just want to say that, I mean, you're one of the greats. I think you're going to go down in history with, Carl Ruck, and I know you disagree.
Well,
with
I think
Wasson,
I disagree with Wasson about Soma, but I should say that as far as entheogenic history, these guys are pioneers. I think it's research on South America and stuff like that I've seen, and mushrooms in Mexico. All that stuff's fascinating to me. You know what I mean? So I don't want to make it like I'm an enemy of Wasson. I have an academic disagreement about the identity of Soma.
Sure. So, yeah, I mean, again, I think we all owe you a great debt of gratitude. Obviously,
well, your movie really brought it to a lot of people. And, over 1 million people have seen your video on cannabis history. So that type of stuff has an effect. It's all important. You know what I mean? And you've reached all those people, and those people are reaching other people with those ideas and spread. A lot of this stuff is outgrowing me. It's like the Jesus healing with cannabis. It's a meme. You know what I mean? And the holy oil, it's like it's got a life of its own, and it does its own thing. If I died tomorrow, this information would just keep rolling and growing, and people keep adding to it and stuff like that. It's its own thing. And the only reason that the research is so solid is I just happened to ask the right question. You know what I mean? It was all just waiting, sitting there, in limbo, just waiting for somebody to put that key in the door and open that door, and then it's all just starts spilling out once somebody asks the right question,
Yep. Well, your research is impressive. Your knowledge is impressive. Do you have anything you want to plug?
Yeah, let's hope that, we get through all this Trump shit, and America, gets a little bit grayer than it has been for the last 4 years. And, there's no point in saving anything. Everybody out there, man, you got to put 110% into life right now, and your interaction with life. The future depends on you, and you will be wherever you're supposed to be when shit goes down. So start getting on top of this, man. The world's in jeopardy, and it needs you. You're the one. Take care, brother.
Chris. Thanks, brother.
Cheers.
All right, it's been real.
Bye.
Bye.